Alright, today we're going to be painting lovely flowering gum, and I'm going to be using a size 4 round brush and a size 0 round brush, or just a kind of small and a tiny brush, but you can use any sizes that you prefer, and it also kind of depends what size paper you're working on. I'm working on some A5 paper. It's 350 GSM, so it's really thick. And it's also lovely and rough, which is perfect for the loose sort of style painting that we're doing today. I've got a jar of warm coloured water and a jar for cool colours. I've got some reusable cloth that I've already used. And I've got some colours mixed up ready to go. I've got a really cool deep green. I've got a yellowy orange and a deep pinky red. It's more on the red side, but it's got a little bit of a pinkish tinge to it. And I've got videos all about materials, a video all about materials and a free guide as well that I'll link below for you if you're not sure about watercolor materials. And I've also got some more tutorials that you'll find really useful, including one about brush strokes. So if you hear me talking about C curves or S curves or anything like that today and you're like, what is she talking about? Check that tutorial out as well and you'll find it really, really helpful. So to get started, I'm going to grab my slightly bigger brush and set aside my smaller one. And I'm going to begin with the stems and leaves for this flowering gum. So I'm just wetting my brush, making sure it's nice and clean, and grabbing some green ready to go. And I'm actually going to dilute that by adding some more water, dabbing that on the side of the water jar, just to dilute it a bit more by adding more water, which kind of takes away some of the pigment on the brush. So to get started, I'm going to be working kind of this way across the page, just using the tip of my brush. I'm going to add a leaf here, kind of making it up as I go, if I'm being honest, just sort of seeing where my hand takes me. And I'm doing that so I've got the stem happening with just the tip of the brush, and then I push down with the belly of the brush and lift up again to do a really long C curve. And I'm going to mirror that C curve here with my brush, doing the same thing. So I'm also doing the compound stroke that you've learnt in my brush strokes tutorial. And I got a bit of stage fright and I kind of went a bit off at the end of this brush, and you can easily fix this brush. I can't even speak. This brush stroke. So it went a bit wonky, which is totally fine. I'm just going to use the tip of my brush to kind of push the paint around to make it a little bit more pointed like the leaf. And I'm going to grab a little bit more paint on the tip of my brush, and I'm going to use just the tip of my brush to sort of allude to where our actual flowers are going to go. So I might have one coming down here, and I'll have one coming down here as well. And I'm not really taking up much space on the page, so I think I'm going to add some more, going a bit further down. It's a quite concentrated paint, which is fine. And maybe another leaf coming off here. So using the tip of the brush, belly of the brush, and the tip of the brush. Don't forget about my brush strokes tutorial if you're like, what is she doing? I could actually get away with just doing that. It's more of an S curve rather than a C curve, but I am going to mirror it to make it a bit thicker. So same thing again, belly of the brush and tip of the brush. And I like this look here, which wasn't planned, but it kind of makes me think of when the gum leaves have like a bit of a nibble mark or a bit of a nibble taken out of them, or a bite mark. So now I'm going to get started on the flowers. So I'll really dilute my green a lot, so it's almost just water on the brush. And I'm going to be painting a couple of little C-curve brush strokes to create the look of the, gosh, I can never remember the names of these things, but the top of the flower. And you can work anywhere on your page, by the way. You don't need to work in the top left, but I've left some space to show some flowers on a different angle as well. So there we go. It's kind of like a bell shape. I'm just using a few random brush strokes here and winging it. And I'm going to, while this paint is still wet, dab in a touch more paint at the top to add some depth. And I'm going to rinse my brush and this is really quite wet paint and it's maybe a little bit too dark, so I'm going to be using my brush to lift some of that paint back off. So if ever you put too much on the page, you can sort of rinse and dry out your brush and lift some paint back off with the brush, which is a really good tip. If you make a mistake, well, it's not a mistake, but if you just put a bit too much paint on the page. So now I'm going to grab some of my lovely pinky red, and I'm actually going to move down to my small teeny weeny little brush. So I'll rinse that, ready to go. That's a good habit to be in, rinse your brush before you get started, because you never know if you haven't cleaned it properly earlier and it might still have some random color in it from a different painting. All right, so I'm going to grab my color, and it's really, really bright, and I actually want it to be quite bright. There's a plane going overhead, and there's been so many cars go past because it's like school drop-off time. So that's very interesting. I'm not sure if you'll be able to hear it or not. Alrighty, so I've got my paint on my brush, just dabbing off any excess, and I'm going to be really just using the tip of the brush for this. So I'm going to start over here using just the tip of the brush, and I didn't even really tap the top of the flower, but if you do, the paint will bleed, and that's okay. Or if you don't want that to happen, wait for the stems to dry and then do this bit. I'm just dabbing off any excess so I have a bit more accuracy with the brush. Just using the tip of the brush to paint these lines, and you'll see that line is a bit thicker. I had more water on it on my brush, and that's why that happened. So I wanted a bit less water on my brush so I had more accuracy for these, which hopefully you can actually see because it might be a little bit small. So I'm doing, oh, that's what happened. That's what I was saying would happen. My two colors collided, and so they're bleeding into one another, which is fine. And it's watercolor, so that's to be expected. So anyway, I'm going to add a heap of these lines. They're just using the tip of the brush, and they're basically C curves with the odd little S curve happening in there. And I'm just working with, I guess, where I think that they would be going, because I'm sort of alluding to the flower rather than trying to paint anything particularly realistic. All right, so we're going to let this stuff dry a little bit and add in some more detail later once it's dried. But while we're waiting, I'm going to paint some more of these flowering gums on some different angles. So I'm grabbing my size 4 brush again and grabbing my paint on my brush, just dabbing off the excess, actually diluting the paint on my brush a little bit more, getting the excess off. And I'm going to paint, just going down the page really freely, making this up as I go. So I'm actually just going to paint the stem to get started with, and then work out where I want my leaves to go. So I'm going to have some of my flowers working on different angles this time. I'm working really freely today. I don't have it sketched out or planned, I'm just making it up. So I'm going to add a leaf here, doing my C curve technique, really, really long, and again. And I'm actually adding in some wibbly bits to add those imperfections that you see in a gum leaf. And I might add another one here. And my brush was actually running out of paint, which is cool because it's added some more texture. Again, unplanned, but really, really cool. There we go. I'll just dab in some more paint while it's wet. That wet in wet technique. And I do have a whole tutorial about painting gum leaves as well if you want to give that a crack. So now I'll wash my brush off, and we're going to move down to the smaller brush. And this time I might, I'll stick with this brush. As I said, very free and flowing today. So I'll paint the top of some of these flowers again. And I'm actually working with kind of the side of the brush now to make that bell shape. And I think I want one of the flowers to be facing the viewer. So I'm going to leave that spot here blank. And I also want this flower to be kind of facing down here, which you'll see it come to life as we go. And I also want like a bit of a bud or one of these flowers to not be fully open yet as well. So I want you to have a few examples to work from, and then you can put your own creative spin on it. And if you work from a photo, that can be really helpful too, because you can see the ways that the flowers move and everything. All right, so I think I'm going to begin with, I've still got lots of drips of water on my brush. I think I'm going to begin with the flower over here, very similar to before, just using these single brush strokes, using just the tip of the brush, really, really lightly. And I'm going to wait until this first layer of paint is all dry, like I did over here, to add some more detail. So this is really just the first layer, so you don't need to worry about having too much depth or variety in your paint. And look, this first layer is awesome as is anyway, but I think it's really fun if you've got the patience and time to add a little bit more detail as well. All right, so that first flower is done for now. And I'm going to paint the bud now. So this flower here, I'm going to paint as if it hasn't fully opened yet. So it's in the process, but it hasn't fully opened. So instead of working out like I was before, these lovely little bits are kind of still pointing in on themselves. And I'm working really delicately. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see it or not, but there's lots of white space between each of these brush strokes here. And I worked really, really lightly with just the tip of the brush without too much water on the brush, because otherwise, like before, it will flow down onto the page and take away some of that detail. And I'll add some more depth to that later, but I'm just going to leave it as is for now. So I'm going to paint my open flower now. So it doesn't have this bell shape because it's open and facing the viewer, so that's you. So I'm going to imagine that that bell shape is kind of hidden behind the flower, and I'm going to be working out from the middle of like an imaginary circle. Although I'm actually painting in rather than out. I think I might vary that depending which direction the brush strokes are going. And I'm just sort of alluding to that flower going behind this one, so the brush strokes are a little shorter there. And I'm not sure if you can see this, but I've dripped some paint on my page, and it's totally fine. It happens every time I paint. You don't need to worry or think that your painting's ruined if that happens, because if that was the case, every painting I do would be ruined. But it's not, it just adds character. So never worry about that kind of thing. Alrighty. I'm going to leave that flower for now, and I know it looks like a bit of a mess, but it's because I'm going to let it dry out and then add some more detail over the top. And I'm going to just finish off this flower here, which is sort of working, it's working down in this direction, and we're sort of viewing it from the side. And it's as if it's sort of, it is open, but it's not as open as some of these other flowers over here. Okay, so now I'm going to rinse off my brush and grab some of this lovely orange paint, or yellowy orange paint that I mixed up earlier. I'm going to dab off the excess, and again I'm going to be using just the tip of the brush. I'm going to go back over to these first flowers. I feel like I need to angle my page a little. I'm going to do a series of dots, really messy, not trying to be particularly accurate or anything. The messier the better, and just using the tip of the brush. And if you have too much paint on your brush, your dots won't look as delicate, but that's okay. That happened here, and they're a bit more blobbish, my dots, so I want my paint to be a little less wet on my brush. So just by dabbing the brush on its side on the cloth, like this, to get the excess off, will help with that. So I am just adding these dots all across, and it's okay if the dots sort of go up and touch the flower itself and work behind. I'm going to do the same over here. So my flower that hasn't opened up yet, we can't see these yet, but for the other flowers we can. And I'm going to work around this flower that's facing the viewer. And yep, I am actually going over the top of this other flower, which is risky business when the other flower is actually potentially still wet. So do as I say, not as I do. Maybe wait till that first layer is dry before doing this. All right, so just using the tip of the brush, little teeny tiny dots all around. Messy is fine. It's fine if they run into each other sometimes and some of them aren't connected to anything. That is all good. All right. I'm actually going to add some more detail and depth, or this second layer of paint, to this first flower now. So I'm hoping that it's dry. I haven't done my usual letting it dry off screen thing. I'm just winging it and being very free and flowing today. But as I said, do as I say, not as I do. So I would recommend you wait until your painting is fully dry, but I'm being a little impatient. So I'm grabbing some paint on my brush and I want it to be quite concentrated. And I'm using just the tip of my brush to add a few more of these brush strokes. I'm actually grabbing some paint straight from my palette to make it really dark and concentrated, just to make that really deep and add a bit more contrast and depth in there. So not adding as many brush strokes as I did before, but just a few to add some depth. So this is the wet on dry technique, which I of course have a tutorial about, and I also cover all of these techniques in a lot more detail and color mixing and all of those things in my online course, which is linked below. And I think you would find that really valuable. But if you're not in a position to grab that, or you're not sure about me yet, I've got a heap of free tutorials here on YouTube as well that you can refer to, that you'll find really, really helpful. So yeah, this is the wet on dry technique. I'm using just the tip of my brush, adding in some more depth. Oh, and I've accidentally moved over to this flower. I'm being so free today. I was meant to be just focusing over here, but I'm moving across. And that's the thing with painting, you just sort of lose yourself in it and just have fun, which is awesome. But when you're teaching, I guess I should probably be a little more structured. But I'm just showing you my real process, I think, today, that I'm just sort of making it up as I go. All right, so using just the tip of the brush, adding in some more depth and detail here as well. I actually really like it when I work a bit quicker using just the tip of the brush, because it makes it even more free and natural looking. And I'm going to kind of fix up the middle of this flower by adding, I don't know if this is the stamen or what, I really need to get, I don't know, I need to work out the wording for these things, but I'm going to add a bit of detail in the middle. So I'm just sort of doing a cluster of dots to fill that in a bit more. And then I'm going to grab some paint on my brush and draw one long line coming out here. It's a bit thicker than the rest. And there we go. And I don't know what's happened there, but it doesn't really matter. I might just stick with just the cluster of dots and pretend that that was deliberate. And I'm not editing that out because I really do want you to see what my process is like. It's just sort of muddling my way through and having lots of fun. So I'm adding a little more detail over here, and then I'm going to wash my brush, grab some of my green, which I might need to mix a little more to add some more detail. So I'm just grabbing it from my palette, adding some more water and hoping it's the right green. So So this is really lovely, dark and concentrated, so I don't need much. Just dabbing it on my page, and I'm going to add a little shadow here on the sides of my flower, just by doing some sort of random brush strokes on one side. And this is definitely something that you'll want to wait to do when your painting is actually dry, otherwise the paint will bleed and you won't get the accuracy that you might want and be aiming for. So I'm adding a little bit of this depth up the side of my stem. My hand's a bit wobbly today, so I'm just doing some really rough brush strokes and hoping that they line up with the stem that I've already painted. You'll see there that I was really, really wobbly, and that is so fine. It really doesn't matter at all. And on my leaves, I'm going to do a few little dots, especially around the edges where there might be little nibble marks, and the tips of the leaf to add a bit more depth. I'm going to do the same over here, hoping that it's dry. A few clusters of dots, even just brushing the stroke, putting some brush strokes with the side of the brush on the leaves as well, and repeating the same process over on this second lot of flowers. So depending on what sort of flowering gum you want to paint, you might mix up a warmer green than the one that I've mixed today. Mine's quite a cool green. You might want to change up the colour of the flowers, the colour of the stems, all sorts of things. But you can use these basic principles of painting your stem with just the tip of the brush, and then putting these little bell shapes, depending on the flowering gum you're painting, to be sort of the tops of the flowers, and then sort of working your way out with the tip of the brush to create the flower itself. And then adding a bunch of dots basically. So when you break it down like that, I mean, I know it takes practice and a little bit of patience, but it can simply be broken down into obviously your brushstroke techniques for the leaves, using the tip of the brush for the stems, and painting these bell shapes with your C curves, and then just some simple brush strokes using the tip of your brush and some dots. So I hope that does actually make it sound more simple and not too complicated. But basically, if you watch my brushstrokes tutorial, you're set, because you'll understand the terminology that I'm using, and then this will all make a lot more sense, and you'll have the tools and the techniques to put them into practice to paint these lovely flowering gums. And mine are nearly finished. I always have trouble stopping my painting. Just adding a little more detail. Just adding a touch more over here on this stem. I think actually before I finish, I want to add a little more depth. Oh no, I mixed my cool colour in my red jar, but it was fine. I'm going to grab some of this orangey yellow and just finish off my dots. Just to add a bit more detail to them as well. So I want it really concentrated on my brush, grabbing a little more yellow straight from the palette in fact. And I've definitely contaminated that with my green. Dabbing off any excess and just adding a few extra dots to add some more depth there as well. So this second layer of dots are much fewer and they're more sparse, and I'm kind of just adding them on one side of the painting, and I'm rushing a little bit, so I probably have a little too much paint and water on my brush, so they're not as delicate as I might have hoped, but it doesn't matter at all. And you'll see that really easily and quickly we add some more detail and depth, and everything really pops off the page. So I'm really excited to see your flowering gums. You can tag me on Instagram in your paintings. I'm at Ruby Tuesday Art, and make sure that you subscribe to my channel. I post new tutorials every Tuesday, And if you love the video, also make sure you share it with friends so they can find me too.